Welcome to Firearms Friday, coming to you from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne. I'm Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian for the museum. And because I've kind of finished going through the 300 firearms in the collection, I was asked if I would like to move on to the swords and bayonets and edged weapons in the collection. And I wasn't too excited about that at first because, for one thing, I didn't know anything about swords. I've been dealing with firearms for decades, but swords are kind of a new area. But once I started, I became fascinated by swords. And we're going to talk about a couple of interesting ones today, and we're going to do, as the video series progresses, we're going to look at some other swords with a direct connection to Wyoming history. So swords are odd in that they've been around for probably 5,000 years. The first identifiable sword goes back to the Bronze Age. And while other implements, knives, axes, spears, arrows, had multiple purposes. They could be used for hunting, for food preparation, for building shelters. The sword, from its inception, had one purpose, and that was to kill other human beings. And why there is such, today, a fascination with these particular edged weapons is fascinating, I guess. And I bet if you are my age, when you were a kid, you had a wooden sword, right? You watched Zorro on TV on Thursday nights and pretended you were a sword fighter or a person using your sword for good purposes. So swords really became embedded in multiple countries and multiple cultures across the world. And even though they're 5,000 years old in origin, they're still a part of the dress uniforms for the American military today. And if you're a generation younger, you probably had or wanted a lightsaber. So today I want to start with a little bit of sword terminology and the different kinds of swords. The two that we have here today, this one, they're both circa introduction in 1840. This is an enlisted man's infantry sword. This is an enlisted cavalryman's sword. And swords basically had three moves or three functions. There was the cut, there was the thrust, and there was defense. And depending on the intended use of the sword would depend on what the configuration was. This is an 1840 heavy cavalry officer's saber. And it was nicknamed the old wrist breaker by the people who had to use it because it is so heavy. So the basic parts of a sword are the blade and the hilt. And the hilt comprises everything that's not the blade. So it is the quillon or the cross guard, it is this bow or knuckle guard, and it is the pommel, and this is the grip. And the pommel is derived from a French word for little apple, for whatever reason. So again, this is a saber, and normally sabers involve this curved blade, and their primary function was the cut. And as time progressed and the mounted cavalry were fighting people on foot or on horseback that might be wearing heavy coats, or in the case of infantry soldiers, they might have that blanket roll over their shoulder. So that cut possibly would not inflict a lethal wound. So for that reason, there was this transition to the straight-bladed sword, which is, again, the thrust. And this is much more likely to inflict a lethal wound than the cut, because it penetrates relatively well through even heavy clothing. So, the cut versus the thrust. I thought just an interesting side note about the best description of a thrust wound comes from the dying Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. Asked by his comrades if he was seriously injured in a duel, Mercutio dryly remarks that his wound is, quote, "not so deep as a well, nor so wide as a church door, but 'tis enough, 'twill serve." And he died from that wound. So, looking at the blade again, this is the ricasso, which is the unsharpened base that leads into the tang of the grip. And this groove here is called the ricasso. And it is not a blood groove. It is not intended to make it easier to withdraw your sword from the body of your opponent. It, in fact, is used to make the sword both lighter and stronger than it would if it were a flat piece of metal. Think about an I-beam and how strong that is. And that's similar to the function of the ricasso in this sword. So again, the old wrist breaker, the 1840 cavalry sword. And again, these were issued to enlisted men, as was the 1840 infantry sword. And that's interesting because as I started doing research and learning about swords, some of the ones we have in the collection are very difficult to identify. And that's because the swords that officers used had a great variety. Officers were required to buy their own swords. So within some fairly broad standards, you could make a pretty fancy sword depending on how deep your pocketbook was. You could have different engraving on the sword. You could have different handle materials. You could have ivory. You could have gold inlays. You could have gold wash on the blade itself. So because they are so inconsistent, they're somewhat difficult to identify accurately, whereas these enlisted swords, for the enlisted people, they all look the same and are fairly easy to identify. And one of the problems I've had as I try to do this research is I had difficulty finding really good reference material. If you go online and Google sword, you get all these fantasy games, online games and books, further documentation how thoroughly the sword has been integrated into our culture even today. So again, a lot of the books that I found were like neat books, but they're coffee table books in the sense that they try to cover a lot of material and cover it very shallowly. The best reference I found was this one called U.S. Swords. And this was published 2020, I believe, and is really good, but it is again limited to U.S. swords. But it covers both military swords and a different type of swords that we'll get into in another video. And those are fraternal swords that were members of like the Masons and the Knights Templar and the Knights of Pythias. When an individual was inducted into one of those fraternal organizations, he was often presented with or purchased a sword that represented the symbols and culture and history of that particular fraternal organization. This is kind of an interesting book. This one is really detailed. It was published in 1884. So leading up to that point, it's pretty accurate and very informative, but again, stops in 1884. So again, I've really become interested in learning more about these edged weapons, and in future videos we're also going to look at some bayonets that we have in the collection. So again, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more videos on swords.